Pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. This webinar is organized by the EU-ABC, but it's in commemoration of Europe's flagship annual event, EU Industry Days. And we appreciate the collaboration with the EU delegation to ASEAN to jointly organize this webinar. The goal of the webinar is to talk about ways that the EU and ASEAN can work together towards a green recovery. And we'll spend a bit of time trying to understand from different perspectives what are the elements of a green recovery. We'll have an overview of how EU and ASEAN can support the EU Green Deal priorities, how they're relevant to both regions, and those range from decarbonisation of the energy sector, sustainable finance, circular economy, and other issues which you'll hear about. We're expecting perhaps as many as 150 people on the call today from different perspectives: government, business, civil society, trade counselors from various embassies. You're welcome to you who are attending this. We have, to start us off, two videos. The first video is from Mairead McGuinness, a European Commissioner, Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union. And so we'll start with that, and then we'll follow with a second video, and then our panel conversation to continue. Please go ahead with the video.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm delighted to join you by video message today to introduce how the European Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm delighted to join you by video message today to introduce how the European Union and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations can cooperate on a green recovery. We've worked together for over 40 years, and I welcome our agreement 3 months ago that the long and fruitful cooperation between the EU and ASEAN amounts to a strategic partnership. We've many areas where we can usefully work together. And today I want to introduce the European Green Deal, and in particular, the area that I'm responsible for as Commissioner for Financial Services, namely sustainable finance, to make sure that finance flows towards sustainability. And of course, we cannot do this work alone. International cooperation is vital in the fight against climate change and promoting a green recovery. The EU-ASEAN partnership is an important forum for this work. The European Green Deal is Europe's green growth strategy. We are determined to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, alongside supporting green jobs and green growth, in line with our international commitments in the Paris Agreement. This is a task that has only become more urgent as a result of this pandemic. The COVID-19 crisis has destabilised our economies and our societies, not to mention its impact on our healthcare systems. That crisis has catalysed a change in expectations that companies and the financial system should focus not just on profit, but also on sustainability and social objectives. So to achieve our ambitious climate and environmental goals, we need huge public and private investments across borders. Our recovery should not look towards the past. Instead, we can use it as an opportunity to build a more sustainable, greener economy. Now, to redirect our financial system towards sustainability is an enormous task, but a necessary one. The European Union has been working on important legislation on sustainable finance. These instruments provide markets with powerful new tools, foster transparency, and improve the integrity of the rapidly growing market for sustainable financial products. First is the Taxonomy Regulation, and this creates one of the world's first ever green lists of projects and economic activities that have a substantial positive impact on the climate and the environment. This is for investors to use as guidance. It is science-based, and it allows investors to know what is green. Currently, the EU Commission is finalising criteria to help companies and investors identify activities that contribute to climate mitigation and adoption. The second part of the EU taxonomy for the other 4 equally important environmental objectives, circular economy, pollution, biodiversity, and water and marine resources, will be adopted by the end of this year. Second is the Disclosures Regulation, which mandates financial market participants to disclose to investors how they integrate environmental, social, and governance issues into their products and processes. We also have the Climate Benchmark Regulation, which will help investors align their investments with climate goals. We will propose an updated non-financial reporting directive in the coming months to strengthen ESG disclosures by corporates, including the development of sustainability reporting standards. And we're also working on a green bond standard and an EU eco-label for green financial services. Later this year, we'll unveil an ambitious and comprehensive renewed sustainable finance strategy, setting out our work so that the financial system and the economy it supports move even further towards sustainability. The first area of focus will be accelerating the transition in the real economy. We want to enable companies to move away from unsustainable activities. The recovery from the COVID-19 crisis provides an opportunity to boost these efforts. We also need to make sure that climate and environmental risks are integrated in the financial system to make it more resilient. We want to put sustainability and long-termism at the heart of corporate and investment decision-making. And of course, we want to empower citizens, entrepreneurs, and retail investors. The strategy will also recognise that sustainable finance is not just about climate, but also broader environmental aims like biodiversity and social objectives. And last, but by no means least, the strategy will focus on global opportunities and coordinated action. International cooperation and support for developing countries are crucial if we want to scale up sustainable finance globally. So let me just say a little bit more about this area of international cooperation. The European Union co-founded the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, and its members now represent over half of global emissions, half of global GDP, and half of the world's population, allowing us to cooperate and share effective sustainable finance policies. We're really pleased that some members of the ASEAN have already joined the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. The EU and ASEAN share a common goal of helping to mobilise financial markets to contribute to achieving the aims of the Paris Agreement and our other environmental objectives. Now, I also want to mention the EU-Asia Pacific Forum, where we meet to discuss regulatory developments in financial markets. The 5th edition is coming up shortly, hosted by Thailand on March the 11th, and sustainable finance will be a really important topic for discussion. In closing, I want to highlight again the recent significant step in the relationship between the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the European Union at the 23rd ASEAN EU Ministerial Meeting. There, we decided, rightly and accurately, to call this relationship a strategic partnership. It's a recognition of our shared values and interests over the past 43 years. We have a strong connection, including in financial services regulation, and this is particularly important in these difficult times when the response to the pandemic and our efforts for sustainable recovery require a lot of cooperation and support. Our green recovery depends on partnership based on dialogue, multilateralism, the rule of law, and a common vision for the future. So I want to wish you a successful and engaging discussion on how we can work together more effectively for this green recovery. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen,
Very good. So I think now we'll turn that's after hearing from Commissioner McGuinness from the European perspective. We now turn to a video remark from Dato Seri Setia Ir Awang Haji Suhaimi bin Haji Ghaffar, Minister of Development of Brunei. Please roll the video.
Your Excellencies, Merit McGuinness, the EU Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability and Capital Markets Union, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, a very good day to you all. It gives me a great pleasure to have the opportunity to address you today to represent Brunei Darussalam as Chair of ASEAN this year. The COVID-19 outbreak has had a profound impact on lives and livelihoods around the world, including in our both region, the EU and ASEAN. Recovery from it, however, presents us with the opportunity in building back better and greener as a region and as a dialogue partners. This is in line with the ASEAN's theme this year under the Brunei Darussalam Chairmanship, We Care, We Prepare, We Prosper. COVID-19 has also presented a multitude of challenges to the world's progress towards achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and also to our mission to limit global temperature rise under the Paris Agreement on climate change. The dual challenge ahead of us is undoubtedly difficult, and while we navigate the road to recovery from COVID-19 crisis, we must not lose sight of our duty to protect the environment and combat climate change, and to do so with utmost urgency. On this note, we must commend ambitious plans such as the European Green Deal that is determined to take the recovery efforts to the next level by turning the climate and the environmental challenges the world faces today into opportunities. ASEAN has adopted the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, Icrf, which serves as a consolidated strategy to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. The framework articulates ASEAN response to the different stages of recovery by focusing on 4 sectors and segments of society that are most affected by the pandemic, setting broad strategies and identifying measures for recovery in line with sectorial and regional priorities. To implement the ACRF, an implementation plan is also developed. ASEAN recognizes that addressing the crisis requires coordinated action, not only within the region, but as well as cooperation with its partners, including the EU, for realizing collective and long-term socio-economic recovery strategies. It is recognized that business and civil society in ASEAN also stand to benefit from initiatives under the European Green Deals and the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Hence, exchanges like this are very valuable to kickstart the conversation on how private and public sectors across the EU and ASEAN can actively play a part in driving the green transition. Ladies and gentlemen, the EU and the ASEAN has established a warm and long-standing dialogue relation for over 40 years now. Our cooperation covers extensive strategic areas in support of ASEAN's key pillars, namely political security cooperation, economic cooperation, and socio-cultural cooperation respectively, and further complemented by the ASEAN-EU Development Cooperation Program. The EU remains as one of the ASEAN strategic trading partners, and this provides us with the opportunity to unlocking opportunities of green recovery through a deeper EU-ASEAN cooperation in areas that could further drive green growth in both regions. In fact, the EU has already been providing valuable support to ASEAN across its political and security, economic and social cultural community pillars, including through the ASEAN-EU cooperation on biodiversity conservation and management of protected areas in the ASEAN region became. Sustainable use of peatland and haze mitigation, SUPER, programs and enhanced regional EU-ASEAN Dialogue Instrument Program, or ERADI, by facilitating dialogues in development cooperation in policy areas such as trade, energy, environment, and climate change, food security, and sustainable development, just to name a few. The study on circular economy and plastics, a gap analysis in ASEAN member states, undertaken in 2019 through the ERADI program, in particular, demonstrates a concrete actions toward enhanced ASEAN-EU partnership in advancing circular economy in the region. In relation to this, also to support the implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, ASEAN and EU has successfully organized the second ASEAN-EU high-level dialogues on environment and climate change via video conference in late 2020. The dialogue provided an opportunity for further exchanges of experiences on environmental and climate goals and promoting regional solutions for a green transition. The European Green Deal, the outcomes of the 31st meeting of the ASEAN Senior Official on the Environment, and putting sustainability at the heart of recovery framework guided the discussion between ASEAN and the EU. Ladies and gentlemen, ASEAN remains committed to a green, inclusive, and sustainable growth in close cooperation with EU as our dialogue partner. A green and circular economy that prioritizes sustainable and low-carbon development could make further ASEAN economies and society more resilient and ensure the achievements of climate change mitigation, adaptation targets, enhance regional energy security, increase food security, and improve access to healthcare, particularly among member states. Drawing on the relevant experiences of the EU, ASEAN stands to benefit from further dialogue and cooperation in areas green recovery. Businesses, industries, and the private sector have a major role to play, as the EU remains as one of the ASEAN strategic trading partners, providing us with the opportunity to unlock opportunities of green recovery through a deeper EU-ASEAN cooperation in areas that could further drive green growth in both regions. For Brunei Darussalam, we are taking bold climate action as we seek to lead green agenda in the region as ASEAN chair. We launched our first Brunei Darussalam National Climate Change Policy in July 2020 as to pave low carbon and climate resilient pathways for the country, and we have committed to reducing 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions from the business as usual BAU levels by 2020 in our nationally determined contribution NDC to the Paris Agreement in the late 2020. We have also declared 2021 as our year of climate action, as to increase a sense of urgency and level of awareness and participation by different levels of the society. On top of that, Brunei Darussalam has banned the use of single-use plastic bags in major supermarkets and retailers across the country. With that, I end my remarks and wish you all a successful panel discussion with fruitful exchanges and partnerships beyond today's event. Thank you very much and stay safe.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me see if we've got the microphone back. I hope this is working. I can now see myself again. So after the two introductory remarks, and I should mention that today our speakers from Brunei, both the development minister and then our closing speaker, are unable to attend. And I should say that is for a reason, and accompany that with a congratulations or good wishes. This is Brunei's 37th National Day. So there are, I guess, a number of great activities going on in Brunei today in commemoration of that anniversary. And so our speakers are not able to be with us. We now, thinking about those comprehensive introductory remarks about a green recovery and the broad range of topics that Brunei, as chairman of ASEAN this year, has outlined as the strategic priorities for ASEAN for the year, we're going to turn to our panel. We have an excellent panel that represents both the European and the ASEAN perspectives, and also represents perspectives from government, from academia, from business, and from civil society or philanthropy. And I think it's important that all those perspectives are represented when we consider the complexity of the issues at hand and the importance of addressing those issues, both short-term and long-term issues. Let me introduce our panel briefly. You all, I think, can see on the materials that were circulated bios, so I won't go into a CV for each individual, but to briefly introduce Ambassador Igor Driesman, Ambassador of the European Union to ASEAN, Dr. Helena Varki, Senior Lecturer of the Department of International and Strategic Studies, University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, Lars Sveen, the President, Developing Regions of Danfoss, and Ann Mettler, the Vice President of Europe at Breakthrough Energy. All of our four speakers, we're going to have an opportunity to address some questions around those two very broad sets of remarks on the question of a green recovery. And then we want everyone who's participating, please use the chat function to be asking questions along the way. So after we have a bit of discussion among the panelists, we'll open up for questions from the audience, and hopefully be able to have a good discussion before we conclude. So let me start with Ambassador Driesman. Ambassador, in listening to the remarks, and then also as we know, those of us who are bridging between, say, a European perspective and an ASEAN perspective, or even within ASEAN between the countries which are the most affluent and the ones that are still at earlier stages of development, sometimes there's a difference of at least a difference of emphasis, perhaps even a difference of definition in what does green mean. And I think it would be really helpful if we could start maybe with your perspectives on what does green mean from the perspective of Europe. And if you see any differences, what are those differences of perception perhaps in ASEAN?
Thank you, Don, and very happy to be here in another distinguished panel which you got together, and grateful that our commissioner and the ministers from Brunei were able to join, at least virtually. On the issue of green, I think you know that what our benchmark is. It's the European Green Deal, which was adopted in December 2019. What I'd like to say about that is that it's really our growth strategy to overcome the challenges of climate change and environmental degradation, and to transform the European Union into a modern, sustainable, resource efficient and competitive economy, where at the same time there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, but also where economic growth is decoupled from resource use. And these principles are really embedded in all the other policies of the EU, from its industrial policy and trade policy to digital and education strategies. So really a roadmap with actions to do all of that. Now, when I read, and I read it just before the webinar again, when I read the ASEAN Comprehensive Economic Recovery Framework, what does strike me, and especially if you take the chapter on sustainability, is that it is exactly the same narrative that ASEAN is using, that is doing back better, but not just in terms of broader narratives, but also the kind of themes that are addressed in that strategy. What is maybe different, to come to your question, is sometimes one sees a different level of ambition in a certain number of areas, and also the instruments are often different. While in the EU, we rather quickly go through EU-level legal frameworks to implement our policies, that is not necessarily the case within ASEAN. But sometimes I'd like to emphasize what we have in common rather than what the differences are. And in this case, it's really striking to see this common narrative, which to some extent I think is new.
That's great. Well, I thank you. I appreciate that, the overlap in themes, I think, is very apparent when you listen to the two videos at the beginning. I wonder if any other panelists have a comment on any of that before I maybe go to the next question. I want to let me just start then by, while we're on that theme of maybe the similarities or the differences, maybe turn to Dr. Varkey. Are you, when you think about this from the perspective, you've looked at this issue from, I would say, economic development perspective, political perspective, strategic perspective. Is this just, are the themes really closely overlapping? Is this just a matter of communicating, or are there some fundamental differences in the interpretation of what green and sustainability means in terms of a green recovery?
Thank you, Don. I'll try to address that. Yeah, so in terms of how I see it, whether there is more of an overlap or points of differences between EU and ASEAN sort of concept of green, I think the ambassador is correct that we do have broad ideas that are quite similar, and the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework is indeed, in terms of language, very similar to the EU. But I think some of the things that we have to acknowledge is that we are in a region, or the ASEAN and EU are two regions which have very different, not only levels of development, but also levels of, or rather strategies of development. And I think that is important. And like the ambassador mentioned, for example, decoupling growth with resource use. So this is, of course, perhaps achievable in a region like the EU, which has a kind of, more industrialized kind of ways of the economy. But in our region, I think the emphasis is still very much on enabling resource use in a more sustainable manner. So it's not necessarily decoupling, but more of finding ways to enable resource use to continue, but sustainably and in a measure that will still allow countries room to develop. So I think that is one sort of point that both sides need to handle and sort of grapple with. The other thing I think relating to what Ambassador also said is in terms of whether or not the goals and the methods to achieve that goals are similar. So I think in that sense, we do have a problem with communicating to each other in that sense of our goals. Because I think, ASEAN has always been talking about, we are very much on board with the UNFCCC's commitments, but one very important element has always been the equal but differentiated responsibilities. So I think there has been a lot of cooperation between the countries in terms of sharing these responsibilities, but I think communication, which I think I will have a chance to go a bit deeper in later on, is the key here, because I think a lot of the communication happens in the media. And this is where the opinions are built, both consumers in Europe, consumers in Southeast Asia, businesses in Southeast Asia. So I think even though our goals are very similar, but the way they are communicated, either through the media or through official channels, need to be very carefully designed to make sure that everyone is on board. And I think this is an area that both sides have been lacking so far.
Thank you. I want to come back to that so that we don't leave ideas that you may have on how we can communicate better. Let me, before we come back to how we can communicate better, let me sort of bring in a business perspective here. Lars, do we have Lars? I can't see Lars on the phone, but I'm on the thing here. Okay, you are here. So when we talk about delivering growth, and we talk about delivering sustainable growth, probably business is, if not one of the most key, maybe the most key factor in how that can happen. And so I think it's great that we have you on the call today. So even though green might be defined differently, what and where do you see opportunities that can lead to both job creation and growth and sustainable recovery at the same time? So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Don, and thanks to all of you here. It's a little bit related also to the other one, because if the world knew what the world knows, that could bring a step change forward and for inspiration learnings. But I think it's also very key to say it's not one silver bullet. And we will see differences, not only between Europe and ASEAN, but also in Europe and in ASEAN. I think that is very important that we stick to each country have different silver bullets, to say it so. And you can say at Danfoss and also backed up by IEA, we have a very clear priority because it's not only a green growth, it's a green growth done in the most financially attractive way, which is definitely also very important here. And that is where we always say, let's start with, let's save the energy we can save, also called energy efficiency. That's typical where we have the shortest payback times. That's still where we are using 40% of our energy today is actually in buildings for cooling and heating. And the good part here is also, it's actually all about job creation too, because that's one of the most efficient way to actually create jobs, which is really also important here in those times. And according to IEA, we can say it's around 9 to 30 jobs per $1 million US spent in energy efficiency. And the good part, we can do it fast. I have just mentioned a few examples here on the left side for that one. What is becoming more and more important, that's the two different hotels, and it's not only for new builds, just to say, but what is also coming more, the next one is, let's use the energy already produced, also called sector coupling, which is coming more and more, because that's both in industry, that is data centers, that is where we very often are saying, okay, if we feed a data center with green current, we are saying, oh yeah, green electricity, we are green. But we can be double green because you have more than 90% waste from a data center. And I just took a few examples here, saying the Facebook just placed here in Denmark. Now we have more than 7,000 households heated up, and we can do exactly the same in ASEAN for the cooling part with absorption chillers. So it's more to say that we can definitely say that energy efficiency first, sector coupling too, and then the rest, of course, we need to make that green to make all based on solar, based on wind, etc. And of course, it's not only also the buildings, also the electrification of the transportation is very important, as it covers 25% of the global energy related greenhouse gas emission. And here we can also say that we start having some examples here, which is also moving very well. But for us, it's very important, as I started saying, don't just think we have one silver bullet for the world, doesn't exist. When people come and want to be helpful to country, be very consistent to listen, understand what's going on in that country before we come with all our good advices. And when we understand that, then we can start really digging into how we can do that. But all in all, I would say, if we do it right, green recovery will be such a big ignition for where we are today, and could definitely improve the cooperation further also between EU and ASEAN. So a lot of good initiative from here.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back to Dr. Varkey about some ideas for better communication. And please be thinking, I'm going to come back to you with some ideas about what, practically speaking, needs to be done better to sort of spur this movement that you're talking about for energy efficiency or energy transition along within ASEAN, and how European business can help. Let me turn now to our fourth panelist, Ann Mettler. Ann, you are heading a very exciting organization in Europe, which I think is relatively new. And so I would appreciate, I want to ask you a question, but maybe you could start before answering the specific question with telling us a little bit about the organization. I guess the question is, having listened to the speakers up to this point and thinking about what Breakthrough Energy is doing in Europe, what kind of examples or projects can you talk about in Europe, and how do you think those might be applied, or at least relevant learnings for ASEAN?
Thank you so much, Don. Hello, everyone. So yes, first let me say maybe a word about Breakthrough Energy, which is of course not a European organization per se, because it was founded in 2015 by Bill Gates. What's important to understand, it is a network of different vehicles. It has an investment fund, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is 2-time $1 billion funds, but Breakthrough Energy is actually a philanthropic organization, so not for profit. And that's very important to understand, because our approach is that according to where a clean technology is in the innovation cycle, you may need different types of vehicles, and it will not always be a company that would be best suitable. You spoke about investments that we are making in Europe. That's absolutely correct. In fact, we're announcing one today, sort of as I speak. This is in a Swiss biofuels company. And this investment is part of an initiative that Breakthrough Energy actually has with the European Commission and the European Investment Bank. It's called Breakthrough Energy Ventures Europe. And it's a 100 million euro fund. 50 million comes from us and 50 million come from the EU institutions. So you spoke about what are some sort of best practices and examples. So this is perhaps the first one that I would mention, based on our experience with Breakthrough Energy Ventures Europe. I think the EU very much has sort of a willingness to engage and to build what I would describe as the new generation of public-private partnerships. We all know that this transition is so big that neither the public nor the private sector can do this alone. So finding fruitful ways to come together to make the necessary investments, I think that is absolutely necessary. And the EU has a couple of very good examples here, including the cooperation with us. Secondly, and here I have one slide that I wanted to show, so no worries, it's not a long presentation, but for this slide, I wanted to very briefly explain that we always look at the entirety of the innovation cycle. Every clean technology undergoes this innovation cycle, from the early stage R&D to the late stage deployment that you see here on the far right. The European Commission has, I think, a very similar view, and it understands that in order for these technologies to be successful, you need to work across the innovation cycle. A typical innovation cycle is about 25 years. That's too long if we want to meet our 2030 or 2050 commitments. But it's very important that you have different sort of programs and vehicles along the way. The European Commission, many of you know, has very strong R&D capabilities through its Horizon Europe program, but it now also has a new vehicle called the Innovation Fund, a 10 billion euro fund, where the money actually comes from the ETS, the emission trading system, and that takes equity in companies that are developing promising clean technologies. And then at the later stage, the Commission would have InvestEU, which is really meant to scale up these technologies. And we take a similar approach at Breakthrough Energy. I won't have time to go into all the various vehicles, but just to say that we always look at the entirety, because oftentimes where public policy goes wrong is we look only at the supply of innovation and not the demand and creating the markets for them. And that's usually then when things go astray. And my third and also final example is what Bill Gates calls the green premium. The green premium is the difference in price between a clean technology and a carbon emitting technology. And oftentimes the green premium is very significant. So it's very difficult to get companies to use, and also consumers to use the clean option. And you see here on the green bar, the green premium tends to go down as we scale up the technologies and as we create markets for them. And this is very, this is part and parcel of sort of our thinking. How do we bring down the cost? And there are different ways of doing it. You can organize the demand. You can also pay down the green premium, which the European Commission is proposing to do through something called the Carbon Contract for Difference. We have a program called Catalyst, where we pretty much want to do the same thing. But my larger point is we really need to think of the evolution and trajectory that clean technologies take in order to understand how do we best get at this. Now, on the question on Asia and the EU and on net zero, I would say that there is huge scope to collaborate on clean tech innovation. We know that 50% of the emission reductions that we need to get to the 2050 net zero targets have to come from technologies that are today not yet commercialized. So there's ample opportunity to cooperate, ample opportunity to create these new markets, and everything that I heard this morning actually makes me quite confident that Europe and Asia will find a fruitful way, and also particularly ASEAN will find a good way of working together in view of reaching the 2030 and also the 2050 targets.
That's great. Thank you. Let me just quickly, before going back to the panel with a question based on what you just said, let's take a minute and make sure that people who are listening understand what we mean by a green premium. This would be, for example, when solar cells, photoelectric cells were first invented, they cost a lot to generate a certain amount of electricity, but now because of mass production and learning about installation, that cost has come down tremendously. Is that what you mean by a green premium?
Yes. So if you look, solar is actually a good example. In the early days of solar, it was prohibitively expensive. And it was actually at the time, Germany and Japan that had a leading role in what in Germany, this what was called the feed-in tariff. That meant that those producing the solar power got guaranteed prices and a guaranteed demand for the solar power. And this came at a very crucial period in this innovation cycle. It was no longer in the R&D phase, but it had also not yet commercialized. And it is in that time that we need these really efforts to bring these technologies to scale. Because it takes so long to build these markets, it is only recently that solar and wind are cost competitive. So if you look at the R&D for solar started in the late 70s, and it took pretty much until today for it to become cost competitive. And we believe that there are ways to accelerate that process to make sure that we can get these clean alternatives much faster, these clean technologies much faster. By the way, not only in Europe, Europe's only 8% of the global carbon emissions. We need them in Asia, where they are the economies that are growing much faster than we are here. And as Helena said, I mean, you still have a lot of development to do. You know, you need resources to develop. So, you know, we really need to think this through and need to make these clean alternatives accessible much faster and at a much more competitive cost.
So with that theme in mind of making things accessible and spreading the word and spreading the technology, let me maybe go back to Ambassador Driesman. Europe has a number of programs operating in the region that are designed to help with transfer of knowledge, exchange of knowledge. I think it's referred to in some of the earlier remarks. I think there's a big new one, I think it's called EFSD Plus. I wondered if you might just take a minute and talk maybe broadly about how Europe is thinking about engaging with ASEAN and possibly bridging some of these technologies or financial mechanisms, et cetera, to assist with the sustainable recovery.
Right, with pleasure. It's true that we do have a number of cooperation programs ongoing, and I'm very happy that the Minister of Brunei has mentioned some of those. Our work on peatlands, our work on biodiversity, our upcoming work on smart green cities. We also work on forest law enforcement. I think as we are at the start of a new financial cycle, we will want to do much more of that, really upscale and see where there are possibilities to also involve business when we can. And you mentioned the EFSD Plus, that would be one such vehicle to do so. And we'll need to articulate very well what happens at the national level and what happens at ASEAN level. That's maybe point number one. Point number two is we need to also articulate that with our policy dialogues, and we have a number of them. Just this week I was 2 seconds late because I was in a webinar on illegal and unreported fishing, which is a key part of the sustainability agenda. We have also policy dialogues on green tech. You mentioned environment, climate change, clean energy, and so on. And then the next level yet is the global level, where we need to see how can we bridge, say, any differences we might have when it comes to, for example, the preparation of a COP26 in December, or indeed the COP15 on biodiversity, the upcoming one in China. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a lot going on, but we need to do 3 things. One, upscale, to articulate better both different cooperation programs, but also with the policy and the political level, and thirdly, communicate on them in a much more forceful way.
Thank you. So you finished with the third point on communicating, and so let me come back to Dr. Varkey on that question, because I think you've been doing a lot of thinking about this. It's clear there's a big need. Both ASEAN and European leaders are articulating basically the same set of problems, but again, ASEAN has a bunch of other issues in relation to, a lot of the, I would say, some of the fundamental aspects of infrastructure and social development, education, healthcare, et cetera, that perhaps Europe isn't facing in the same way. What can we do to bridge the communication gap? And is it more than a communication gap that we need to bridge?
Thank you. Yeah, actually, it's a lot of things. It's not just communication, because when you think back about if we think about what has been discussed in society, in the media lately about EU-ASEAN relations with regards to environment, I think everyone will be able to recall there was the case about plastic waste, illegal plastic waste dumping in Southeast Asia in the past 2 years. There's also the case about palm oil, EU, the whole idea about whether EU is going to ban palm oil as used for biofuels in Europe. So I think because, of course, the reason why they have become the newsworthy item is because it is newsworthy in itself. And I think the important thing is that policymakers do react to what is in the news. So we have to realize that, these kind of things are the ones that capture the imagination and the attention of people. And we have to figure out how to is that both sides need to be able to look from the other's perspective to see how certain decisions, how certain policies are viewed. So for example, for the palm oil issue, one of the underlying issues was that the European Union does not acknowledge Malaysian or ASEAN-based certification systems. So I think this is something that really hits a nerve in ASEAN. So, innovation also happens here. There are advancements of ideas taken more seriously by Europe as well. Of course, we do want this amalgamation of innovation, but I think both sides need to be more accepting of the other's way of doing things, and this is how we can meet in the middle and progress. So I think there has been some positive movement, as Ambassador has mentioned. In plastics, we have the EU-ASEAN Workshop on Circular Economy for Plastics. This is part of the EU's Global Agreement for Plastics. And in palm oil, EU has been a great investor in ASEAN on its efforts to manage peatlands, which has been very useful in sort of managing fires in the peatlands, the sustainable use of peatland and haze mitigation in ASEAN. 24 million euro project. So that was a great contribution, and ASEAN is continuously looking into this very seriously. One thing that I would like to mention is for the past 2 years, I've been looking so much into the whole communication and the politics between EU-ASEAN over palm oil and biofuels. And I think something really confident that has happened in the past months is the EU-ASEAN Joint Working Group on Palm Oil. In the past, I did not see much hope for actually both sides being able to see eye to eye on this. There was very much sort of animosity, but I think the fact that we now have a joint working group is very positive, and I think there is a a way forward here. One of the key things that came out of this, one of the key objectives was that ensuring that environmental challenges within the palm oil sector are mutually understood with a view to addressing them in a holistic, transparent, and non-discriminatory manner. This was one of the key points of the press release, and I think this really underlines the fact that the problem may be the same, but the issue lies in whether or not both regions understand things in the same manner. So I think this is what perhaps both regions need to be careful about. I will stop there. If we can continue later, that would be fine.
Thank you very much. Well, that issue, palm oil and biofuels, as was not just a matter of dispute on a particular sector. It actually, as your work I think points out, and we all know, becomes a bigger political issue, and it becomes harder to manage other matters, trade matters, investment matters. It begins to politicize things that have no relation whatsoever to biofuel. And so your point about finding mechanisms to have open and transparent ways to resolve differences and not derail progress on other areas, I think is a very important learning there. So resolving differences and continuing to make progress. Let me come back to Lars. I mean, Lars, you laid out some very good examples of huge opportunities to both reduce emissions, reduce energy usage, create jobs. There must be some things that can be done to make that happen better, quicker, faster, remove barriers. What are some things, if you had some suggestions you could make to governments within ASEAN or to the ambassador, to others in Europe, as to how we can move that agenda productively in a way that Dr. Varkey is saying that both sides feel it's a win-win?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Don. I would like to start where I actually started last time. If the world knew what the world knows, and it doesn't today. So I think the first one also companies need to get further into is all about awareness. Seeing is believing. I think sometimes we are simply too complicated. We are too often more in the component area than in the solution area. So what I would propose is simply we ask much more for, call it pixie books, for everybody, also decision makers knows how that works. And yes, all the technical part, let's leave that out of that, because what I also said, we already have a lot of opportunities out there ready to be implemented. And we are not all into that because people are simply not aware. And also what Anne said, let's get those up running, and then in parallel also start developing new technologies. But somehow we are simply waiting, simply because decision makers are not aware of opportunities already there. So what I'm a little bit after is catalogs of ideas in a very simple way, also showing how that could be done in some specific countries. And of course, it's also about to be concrete and fact-based. It's something also about we need to accept that we need to train the workforce. That's also something I think companies could do more about. And I think most important is also to realize, we are talking about a lot about this green recovery. If we don't realize the world tomorrow will become different compared to the world yesterday. So it's also a lot about mindset. This is not only a little bit here, a little bit there. Let's dare to take those steps now and then do that in a professional way. And that's where I think also companies need to play a more significant role, really going into the solutions and be a provider of that also. And then afterwards, yes, one day we will also see the component, but that's, and last but not least, because I think we need speed here. And speed we only can get if we all are aligned, we are all in the same boat, and we all want to go forward here.
Where do you see that leadership needs? You mentioned leader. What you're talking about is leaders. Somebody has to step up and take the initiative here. I mean, is that something you see? Are there any countries or examples in the region where you would say that this is occurring and it's moving in a good direction? Here's some things we can learn. Examples that we could take and other people could apply.
I think the Singapore Green Plan 2030 is actually a good example how we concrete are now moving in, because this is all about, and that is not only for Singapore, it's more the methodology, how and the process, how we actually can do that, and simply ask also for again, I would name it picture books. Let's don't make it more complicated than needed, and then take it from there. But that would be a good example for me to actually to look into that one.
So take this isn't necessarily Europe to ASEAN. This is ASEAN to some extent.
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
the theory here is not it's collegial in that regard within ASEAN.
Yeah, and you can say what we do in Europe. We take a whole city. We go to the mayor and the decision makers, and we are not coming with. We come with the concrete examples. Here, what you could do, and then let them pick, and then let's discuss, and let's start there how we can do that. And I think that's somehow also what we should do more and more. Be very focused, but be very direct, and keep out all the technical difficult stuff. Leave that to the people knowing that. And sometimes that's overfloated in our discussions.
Well, this is very important, I think, in your the idea here that you have to have the decision makers in the process and bring them the opportunity and show them what's possible, but then they have to be willing to set a long-term direction so that business can organize around that.
Exactly.
Speaking of long-term directions, let me go back to another. We briefly touched on palm oil, which seems to be. It sounds like there's a constructive process now to bring some progress in resolving the differences there. I've got a question. Let me just say it's a politically loaded question. I'm going to try to ask it in a less politically loaded way. The EU Green Deal and some of the aspects of it, for example, carbon border tax adjustments, for example, this is what the question is about. Some people, critics in the region, could consider that as and they've used the term in this question, climate colonialism, imposing European standards and values on another region. I think I can understand that's an honest question somebody's asked. Perhaps Ambassador Driesman, you'd be put to give you the hot potato there to see how you might respond to that. What's the logical scientific basis, the reason that the border adjustments are critical to the Green Deal, and why is this something, and how might this be implemented in a way that would be considered fair and reasonable to trading partners, for example, in ASEAN?
Thank you, Don. Maybe starting with the broader point, I do acknowledge there is that perception out there that some of our policies might be protectionist. That some of it is not meant to protect the climate or the environment, but rather to protect our own economies. Now, I think I can say 1 time, 2 time, 3 time, 4 time, 100 times that's not true. People will never believe it, but let me just say it's not true for the record. I think all that we do will be and is WTO compatible. And if it is not, well, then the WTO court will say it is not, and then we can and will adjust our policies. I think the level of urgency requires us to take action. There is a real problem out there, which is called carbon leakage, which is basically the fact that companies are leaving or could leave the EU if they consider that they basically have to pay too much to adapt to our legislation, and hence it's something that we need to address. Having said this, is very difficult also technically. So there's definitely a lot of details, a lot of things to be worked out on this and on many other policies, because we might have indeed very high goals and far-reaching policies, but we count only for so much in the world economy. So definitely it's not something that we can do alone. We need partners, and ASEAN is probably up there amongst the top partners that we want to achieve this with. And this goes to the point that Lars made. We need to listen to each other. And to come back to what Elena said, we're very happy that we now have this working group on palm oil. It's something that we've asked for a very, very long time, because there too, one can say for 100 times, there is no ban on palm oil. The perception there is somehow we're unable to beat that, even if the trade figures and the import figures say give you a completely different picture. But it's only by talking to each other that we can actually address some of the issues. And of course, there's real concerns that we need to listen to and try to accommodate as much as possible. Don?
Thank you. Let me, and I think that's a very fair answer. And I would just add a couple of thoughts from the perspective of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, as we've been regularly engaging in trade and investment missions, virtual missions in the last year with various government ministries in various ASEAN countries. And a couple of things to mention, I think, that are relevant. Right now, Europe's gathering the attention because Europe, I guess, is the only large trading entity which has put forward this carbon border adjustment as a formal idea, stated an intention to do it. But if one looks around the world at all the other countries that are now starting to pledge carbon neutrality or net zero by some date in the future, including China by 2060, and look at what's going on in those countries, Japan is now joined that group. China, everyone, but many of those countries, including Japan and China, are looking at implementing some sort of cap and trade system within their economy to control and reduce carbon emissions over time. And so I believe that in relatively short order, if that continues, and we'll see where COP26 turns out, but if things continue to move in that direction, you will see other countries starting to turn their attention to having, because this cap and trade creates a carbon price. And that carbon price, if it's only applied to domestic companies, whether those are European companies or Japanese companies or Chinese companies, and those companies move to some other country that isn't part of that system, it won't be long, I suspect, before other countries begin to look at some sort of border adjustment mechanism as well to deal with the same issue you talked about that Europe's dealing with. There was actually legislation years ago presented in the US Congress for cap and trade. It fell out of favor, but now that the administration has changed and come back toward the climate talks, and I suspect we'll see perhaps the US move in that direction. So I don't believe, at the moment, Europe is attracting the strong attention on this issue, but I would think if you look at what's going on in the other countries, ASEAN might be wise to consider that this is not something that will go away. In some form, a carbon price for exports is going to probably be a factor at some point. The other thing I will mention we're discovering and through these trade and investment missions is that the companies of the world which are pledging to green their supply chains, okay? If Lars mentioned Facebook's data center in his example. So when a major company like Facebook locates a new data center, if they've made a pledge to green the energy around that data center, the question is which country will get that data center investment? If my country is 100% fossil fuel energy and has a lot of coal-fired power plants, for example, producing that energy, I won't be able to offer Facebook the green energy that it needs to locate that new data center. They might go to my neighbor if my neighbor has greened their energy grid. So there's a tremendous amount of, I would say, importance now being attached to FDI, including within ASEAN. We used to think that the greening of the energy grid was the energy minister's problem, but actually now the trade minister or the investment authority is saying, wait a minute, this could become our problem. What are we doing to think about energy transition? And you'll remember in the Brunei summary, and I think we'll hear this again in our closing remarks from the finance minister in Brunei, energy transition is one of those key elements of this year's planning within the ASEAN priorities. So I think whether this at the moment may be, Europe may be the lightning rod to attract attention around carbon border adjustments. We will be seeing, similar kinds of pressures coming to incorporate, lower carbon planning in the economies of any country that has an export target or a part of their goals. So I'm sorry for that diversion from the moderator, but I think this is very fresh on our minds as we're still engaging, weekly in these conversations in the region. Let me turn. Would anybody like to comment on that issue around border adjustments, carbon requirements on countries, and whether, Dr. Varkey, anything in your work that you want to comment on what we just talked about? Border adjustments, how does that get communicated in ASEAN, and how do we
I think this is always very challenging, and like the ambassador said, the devil is in the details, right? So if we read carefully, but not everybody is going to read carefully, for example, the RED, but what gets trickled down to society and to the politicians are what the sort of big ideas, and this will often get convoluted into the history that we share, with EU and ASEAN, and the whole idea about North and South. So this is something that even though we try scientifically to say that there is a scientific basis for all this, but the reality is that politics still often trump everything, and this is why I think we have to be very careful in, even when we talk about equal but differentiated responsibilities, the way in which the sort of investor or the contributor countries want to invest in the developing countries, the way in which they do that they have to do it very carefully. Like I mentioned just now, innovation also happens here. It should be on an equal basis. And I think very importantly, the sort of investors should remember that, or rather the regions who are doing the investing should remember that they should not try to project their issues to us. We have our own issues, like you mentioned before. And I think the wiser way to build this cooperation would be to really come in and say, we want to help you, or we want to cooperate to help you with your own issues, and not sort of say, by the way, by you doing this, it will also help in us achieving our goals. So maybe it could happen hand in hand, both at the same time. But the communication and the sort of upfront terms maybe can be repackaged in a way that can deal more sensitively with this historical and this sort of political connotations around the issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful. So coming from the perspective of how can we understanding as by each side understanding the other's perspective and then looking to solve problems is always good. Thank you. So I'm going to go to Anne and Lars just a second. So Anne, please comment on that, and then I want to come back to you and Lars with a question that's come up from the audience.
I think there are two aspects of what we're discussing here. Number one is the carbon border adjustment, where you are right, Europe has a plan. But I think it's important to point out, as you did, Dawn, that the Europeans are maybe at the forefront, but others will follow. I can tell you with certainty that the United States is thinking maybe not about a carbon border adjustment, but perhaps around clean product standards. And what I have to tell you, in my previous life, I've worked at the European Commission, so I come out of public policy. And I have to tell you, we tried in Europe to decarbonize industry, with the result that a lot of industry just left Europe and produced elsewhere under conditions that were much less sustainable than had they stayed in Europe. So this has been tried and tested, and this hasn't worked for us. It's the carbon leakage that the ambassador spoke about. And it was that realization that if we are really serious about a 2050 net zero target, there was no way that we were going to be able to achieve that if the borders stayed open to any kind of product from anywhere without any consideration of the carbon footprint. It's impossible. So I agree, we need to work with partners in ways that are conducive, that are not seen as protectionist. I mean, one idea that is being discussed in Europe right now is perhaps carbon clubs, where maybe we start with a transatlantic one, but open to China. I mean, that would already cover a lot of the world. In essence, what we are living through right now is a race to the top. this energy transition is the biggest transition any of us will ever live through. And it will change everything. And it is coming because it has to. I mean, climate change is real. So, you know, we need to make these changes. And so that was on the first one, on the imports. But another important aspect here, I feel like, is the EU is, of course, also the largest development aid donor in the world. And I think, especially where we go or others go to build infrastructure, we need to pay attention that that infrastructure really is sustainable. It is, frankly, not acceptable anymore that countries go and build coal power plants, you know, and tout their own green credentials at the same time. This cannot be done. We cannot reconcile that. So my point is, I think there are different ways of looking at it. Definitely imports is one way, but also investment, infrastructure investment, foreign assistance. So I'm saying I have a lot of sympathy, but let's try to have this conversation and see how we can, you know, engage in this race to the top, because it needs to include everyone and not just Europe or the United States. I mean, everyone needs to get there.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So let me start with Lars, and I'll come back to Anne, if I may. The question has come in relation to the engagement of, does Danfoss engage with local SMEs and businesses? Do you see a willingness from business in the region in learning more from your sustainability? I think this, I don't attend any meeting in any country or an ASEAN level meeting that the key priority of MSMEs isn't raised. It's raised everywhere in every country. I think we all know that, you know, small business is the largest employer across our region. And so part of we go back to the politics, a couple of people have mentioned politics on this call, somehow winning hearts and minds and showing livelihood improvement for SMEs is a key part of any economic transition or transformation strategy. So let me start with Lars. Lars, is there a role for SMEs and MSMEs in implementing and in the Senate, the kind of things that you're doing and talking about? And that could, let me start with existing SMEs, and I'll come back to innovation, because I think that's where Energy Breakthrough maybe is also, you know, there are new SMEs being formed every day in this area.
Absolutely. That was actually also one of my main points here to say, because if we are looking into the energy efficiency area, where you have a lot of SMEs, contractors, smaller installers, that's where their home court. And that means actually, if we're doing, again, I'm back to, if we're doing this right, absolutely. What I'm still back to, that it is a big elephant we try to eat here, and we should not take one, we need to take it bite by bite. So I also think that is back to that, for sure, if we take those having biggest job creation opportunities first, also where we are at the moment, let's do that. But we are back to the decision makers, we are back to the prioritization, we are back to get all those layers of confusion away, and then simply take it step by step. But say it very short, I see that what we're doing at the moment is one of the biggest boosters for green recovery, but definitely also for the job creation. And we simply just need to be very down to earth and take it bite by bite. But no doubt, I would say, especially the energy efficiency part is where we will create a lot of jobs. And we can do that also with jobs where you have, again, paybacks times of less than 3 to 5 years. And let's start with those, where we're also getting job creation. Then we can take the next one, then we can take the next one. But in short, yes, there is also a lot of opportunities for already existing SMEs.
Thank you. So Anne, is you know, how does Energy Breakthrough have kind of formal incorporation of SME, MSME thinking into its planning, sort of how to engage and get solutions that can reach that segment of business?
Well, if you consider that startups are sort of emerging SMEs, definitely yes. I mean, Bill is an entrepreneur at heart, so much of what we focus on are startups in the clean tech space, and there what I can tell you is there's so much happening. And I think, and by the way, not only in Europe, I mean, but across the world. My own background is very much in digital tech. And what I see as the difference here in clean tech is it's really sort of technology with a purpose. It is a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs find a lot of meaning in developing these clean technologies that can help solve the climate crisis. So there's lots going on there. The other thing I would say on SMEs is that, again, in comparison to digital tech, we work tirelessly in Europe, and I know this has also happened elsewhere, on getting digital technologies into companies. I think in clean tech, this is a little bit different because a lot of the biggest carbon footprint is in certain sectors, such as steel, cement, buildings, building materials. So if you can decarbonize them and the SMEs start using them, they will, by definition, start decarbonizing. So if you use clean products and you do what Lars is advocating, the energy efficiency and looking, what are sort of the low-hanging fruits, if you couple that with sort of the new technologies, I think we can successfully decarbonize SMEs, because I know this is a lot of a very difficult process for them. Commissioner McGuinness spoke about these reporting requirements. SMEs already have a lot of reporting requirements. Now they have, also ESG reporting requirements. So we're asking a lot, and we should really think about how can we help these companies to decarbonize? How can we help these companies be successful in this transition? But I think we can do that, and we should learn from everything that's gone wrong in digital tech to do it better and help these companies be more successful in the energy transition.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up to the end of our time. This has been terrific. I'd like to, maybe if I could, without imposing, call on the ambassador to, we've heard a lot of good ideas here, including I think the last few comments about how there's room to find ways to create jobs in a relatively fast track among SMEs, MSMEs, and perhaps bring some of these ideas for innovation and technology, maybe even some financing. Is this something that, as we're thinking about the overview of the relationship, that where there's room we can make progress this year?
Thank you, Don. I do think so. I think there's a lot of interesting points that have been made during this webinar, and it does make me think with business in a more structural way beyond the excellent webinars that you organize from time to time, and see where, say, sector by sector in a more close way. That I mentioned different policy dialogues that we already have with ASEAN on energy, environment, climate change, you name it. But I think often the link with business is still nascent. We still need to build, as at the same time we need to build with ASEAN. So I think we have our work cut out for us in the coming months.
Well, that's great. I mean, I do think there's been a lot of good food for thought on this, and there should be an opportunity to crystallize some of these things, as you pointed out, into sector-based maybe projects to look forward. And for example, just take what Anne just said, or what Lars just said, and what Dr. Varkey said about starting with the problem that exists in ASEAN from the ASEAN perspective. If one of the issues around green recovery is creating sustainable jobs, we hear that everywhere, and we heard that in the presentation from Brunei. I think we'll hear it in a few minutes in the closing remarks. There should be very concrete ways to create 10,000 jobs here or 1,000 jobs there in terms of sectors by greening sector, by bringing in new green technologies, or just doing the very basic things that Lars was talking about earlier. So good opportunities in the short term and the long term. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to our panelists for excellent comments and good back and forth. We took on some fairly controversial issues, and I think we all ended up smiling and thinking there's a better future ahead. So thank you. And let me now just bring us to a close in our closing remarks. We're very privileged to have a video from the Honorable Dato Seri Setia Dr. Awang Haji Mohammed Amin Liu bin Abdullah, who is the Minister at the Prime Minister's Office and the Minister of Finance and Economy of Brunei. We're going to conclude with his remarks, and that will be the end of this program. Thank you. Move the video.
Your Excellency, Donald Kanak, Chairman of the EU-ASEAN Business Council, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, afternoon, and evening. Let me first begin by thanking the EU-ASEAN Business Advisory Council for giving me the opportunity and the honor to speak at this auspicious event. It is unfortunate that I'm not able to join you at this video conference, as this event coincides with the celebration of the 37th National Day of Brunei Darussalam. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we have all experienced, no region in the world is safe from the impact of the coronavirus. The pandemic has disrupted global and regional socio-economic order by challenging our supply chain resilience, restricting our economic activity, as well as putting a halt to the movement of people across borders. Given the extensive impact of the pandemic, it is obvious that we will all need to stand together. Only solidarity will ensure that we can combat the pandemic effectively. It is in this spirit that ASEAN has heightened its collective efforts towards strengthening the region's economic resilience by ensuring open and connected supply chains, as well as increasing trade and investment within ASEAN and its external partners. One such effort is the adoption of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan by the ASEAN leaders during the 37th ASEAN Summit in November last year, which aims to address the region's needs in the transition to the new normal, as well as advancing to a more sustainable and resilient future in the long term. Indeed, it is heartening to see that the region's initiatives are geared towards converting this adversity into opportunities, an opportunity for a change in thinking, an approach that addresses shortcomings, and seek to provide a better future for generations to come. No doubt, the pandemic has changed how the world functions. It has definitely hastened digitalization in the region. Thus, it is important for ASEAN to safeguard the security of the region by enhancing cybersecurity capabilities, while also being cognizant of new and emerging technologies. Additionally, ASEAN must continue to demonstrate its resolute support and commitment for multilateralism. Therefore, 2021 will be the year where ASEAN as a region must intensify efforts towards building an ASEAN community that is inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and dynamic. We believe that no one should be left behind in ASEAN's recovery. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, under the theme of We Care, We Prepare, We Prosper, Brunei Darussalam hopes to build on the momentum of last year's effort, especially in combating and recovering from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. To this end, Brunei Darussalam hopes to emphasize on three fundamental aspects. First is caring for the people and each other's well-being. Second, preparing for the future opportunities and challenges. And finally, prospering together in a unified region. It is against this backdrop that the proposed Priority Economic Deliverables, or PEDs, under the ASEAN Economic Community for our ASEAN Chairmanship are formulated and categorized into 3 strategic thrusts, which emphasize on the importance of strengthening ASEAN's resilience in the context of preparing for future opportunities and challenges. The 3 strategic thrusts are recovery, progressing together towards the region's economic recovery; digitalization, leveraging on new technologies and digitalization for the resilient ASEAN; and sustainability, in pursuit of advancing an inclusive and sustainable economic growth in ASEAN. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me first touch on recovery, which covers 4 of our PEDs. First is to conduct a comprehensive assessment to streamline non-tariff measures, NTMs, in ASEAN member states. This includes the development of an NTM toolkit, which can be used to review NTMs in terms of compliance, enforcement, and design. Second is to develop a recovery plan for ASEAN tourism, which is one of the most impacted sectors. This plan will help provide comprehensive and coordinated solutions to enhance sustainability, resilience, and social inclusiveness in ASEAN tourism industry during and post-pandemic. Third, we aim to announce the launching of the negotiations for the possible ASEAN-Canada FTA. The foundation of this FTA has been laid out, and we believe it is timely to launch this FTA. Fourth is to develop the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework, which would facilitate investments into the region and prepare for the post-COVID-19 new norm. Furthermore, it would help to integrate ASEAN into global value chains and contribute to ASEAN's comprehensive recovery effort. Under the second strategic thrust, digitalization, we have 2 PEDs, which are the 5th and the 6th. For the 5th PED, we aim to develop a work plan to implement the ASEAN Agreement on Electronic Commerce. This work plan will guide member states on how to advance the effective implementation of the ASEAN Agreement on e-commerce over the next 5 years, both at regional and national level. The 6th PED is developing a regional action plan in the area of cyberspace as recommended by the 2015 United Nations Group of Governmental Experts on Information Security report. This will help the region in implementing cyber norms and cooperation activities to develop the required capabilities. The third strategic thrust is sustainability, which consists of 4 PEDs, our 7th to 10th. The 7th PED is on developing an ASEAN framework which will support food, agriculture, and forestry small producers, cooperatives, and MSMEs that have been severely impacted by the pandemic. This deliverable aims to improve their product standards and raise their competitiveness. Our 8th PED focuses on energy, and that is to develop an ASEAN joint declaration on energy transitions and energy security. This is expected to set out ways for ASEAN to cooperate in the pursuit of energy transition and energy security. 9th PED is looking at developing a framework for circular economy for the AEC. This is a new concept for the region, and therefore it is important to identify at this early stage the key areas of circular economy which are of relevance to the work of the AEC. drawing upon global and regional best practices. Last but not least is the 10th PED, which is on delivering key recommendations to advance ASEAN cooperation in mineral resource development in light of opportunity arising from global trends and shifts in the global minerals and metals markets. This PED will contribute to the Sustainable Community Development Goals of the AEC Blueprint 2025. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it goes without saying that the private sector plays a very important and significant role in stimulating the economy, in advancing innovation, and ensuring our markets remain open and competitive. While economic agreements and cooperations are in place to help set the direction of our economic integration agenda, for a development to be truly inclusive, it will require a holistic and deeper understanding of on-the-ground needs and demands. The experience and expertise of the private sector in the utilization of technology and innovation, for example, will be invaluable in our post-pandemic recovery efforts to ensure that the shift towards a digital era are all inclusive. This will solidify ASEAN's commitments to protect people's lives and livelihoods, maintain socio-economic stability, while also build momentum for sustainable development and inclusive growth. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as can be seen, Brunei Darussalam's PEDs under the Sustainability Trust has special resonance with the EU Green Deal initiative in a way that they are designed towards achieving our region's sustainable agenda on environmental protection for the present and the future, adapting and responding to climate change, as well as the transition to green energy and circular economy. Thus, the EU Green Deal would present a wonderful opportunity for ASEAN and EU to align our vision together towards achieving this goal. We would definitely welcome any exchange of knowledge and experience with interested and able partners from the European region so we can kickstart this process smoothly. In this regard, I look forward to active engagements by the ASEAN and EU businesses and for them to work hand in hand to ensure our short to long-term recovery goals are achieved. In closing, I would like to once again thank Your Excellency Donald Tannock, Chairman of EU-ABC, for giving me the opportunity to address this webinar. I look forward to your continuous support towards our ASEAN chairmanship and priority economic deliverables. Thank you.
And so, in conclusion, let me just say thank you again to the European Commission, the delegation to ASEAN. Thank you, the government of Brunei, chairing ASEAN this year, for those two very comprehensive addresses. Thank you to our panelists for a lively discussion, and thank you to all of our participants who came on today, who asked questions, and who have stayed to the very end. We appreciate the opportunity. EU-ABC will be having other webinars. We always appreciate the opportunity, and we love to hear comments that talk about alignment and engagement of business and government together to work on all of these very important opportunities. Thank you all. Have a green and safe recovery. Take care. Bye-bye.